Well, that was the year that was, and it doesn't fail to deliver. But back for this session, I'm joined by Joe Brusuelas. Joe, welcome back. Good to see you, Joe.
Thank you.
And I'm delighted to introduce RSM UK economist Thomas Pugh. Hi, Tom. Welcome.
Hi, Simon. Excited to be here.
It's really good, and today's a good day for you, Tom. You're in the lead Financial Times article on the September and Q3 GDP statistics, so well done on that. Look, I'm just wondering, we've had some fantastic discussion and debate today so far with lots of insight. I'm really wondering, given that I've got two economists with me, what the data says, and in particular what the data is saying about energy usage with a climate theme, but also two other things. And I'm wondering, from an economic standpoint, is the use of resources to a climate mitigating operational policy going to result in lower productivity for that business? And then also, does the growth of GDP globally inevitably mean that there's going to be more carbon emissions? Now, there's a fair few questions in there, but Tom, why don't you kick us off this session in terms of that first bit on energy? Be interesting to see what your views are.
Thanks, Simon. So there really is kind of a school of thought or a viewpoint out there that in order to reduce CO2 emissions, we have to slow growth or stop it or even reverse it. And I hope kind of by the end of our discussion that I'll have convinced you and everyone else watching that actually that's not true. And in fact, framing it like that is actually a really bad idea. Okay. But to get on to the data, so this is a chart just basically of fossil fuel use over the last few years and where we are now. We've heard a lot of pledges over the last couple of weeks in Glasgow, but the facts on the ground are fossil fuel use is still going up, 1-2% a year. Now, it's not, fossil fuel use still accounts for the vast majority of energy use in the global. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of this chart, you'll see that little collection of slivers. That's the cumulative amount of renewable resources that we're using at the minute. That tiny little bit there is kind of what we're driving towards. But it's not all bad news. We're seeing exponential growth in wind, solar, other forms of renewables. And if you just look at that chart, that really is exponential growth. That means in 10, 20, 30 years' time, that kind of little sliver at the bottom of that last chart will hopefully be much, much bigger, and eventually needs to become the majority of global energy supply if we're going to decarbonize the global economy.
Tom, given those stats you put up there in terms of, sorry, Tom, if you put in those stats in terms of the coal and fossil fuel usage, how much of that is China? Is that China's economy is built on the use of coal-fired power stations for a while yet? I assume that's what's one of the main reasons that's driving that increase.
Coal specifically is China is about 50% of coal. India is another large chunk. The US is another large chunk. They are by far the three kind of largest coal users. And you're right, especially in China and India, coal power is going to be around for quite a lot longer.
So Simon, I think it's important here that we make the case that it's not a zero-sum game that we're caught up in here. That each economy is going to move forward on its own logic based on its own interests. And it's in the interest of both the UK and the US to move forward and to begin to decarbonize its own economies, regardless of what the Indians or the Chinese choose to do. Now, I've been to China. I've been in Beijing on an afternoon where you could not breathe. and it's literally painful to be outside. We all see the video of what Mumbai looks like on any given day. My sense is the internal dynamics of those economies and the politics, even in the authoritarian country of China, will play out. Well, they'll move, but they'll move on their own accord. We will move in our economies to decarbonize because it's actually in our economic interest to do so. Great chart. It does show that wind and solar are just really a fraction of overall usage and utilization right now, but that's going to grow, especially at a time when we haven't made sufficient investment in actual fossil fuels. Let me give you a sort of an interesting example. U.S. oil production actually peaked in 2019. Okay, that was expected. Why? Because U.S. investment in fossil fuels turned over starting in 2013. So for people out there saying, well, the decline or the increase in oil prices is all about ESG and the environmental movement, no, it's not. It's because the oil and gas industry has been a mess for over a decade, and only recently cash flows have returned to those businesses. So what do we see? Well, the lack of investment has resulted in higher prices. Those higher prices will in turn result in further development of renewables. It's the interesting interplay so that over the medium to long term, all of the prices will come down. But for now, we're at the beginning again of that long and bumpy transition to a more cleaner, more sustainable future.
Tom, do you want to carry on? And this chart you've got up now is showing the point Joe made about each domestic economy making their own journey. This is an interesting analysis of the UK's CO2 emissions, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So we're focusing on just the UK here, and the UK, to be fair, has been pretty good. Emissions have been on a solid downward trend over the last 50 years. If you just extrapolate that trend, continue it out for the next 30 years or so, we will be, emissions will continue to decrease. There'll be about 200 million tons by 2050. That's pretty good. But if we want to hit net zero by 2050, like the government target is, then we're going to have to do kind of a lot more to push that line down. And that's going to be, each sector is going to have to kind of play its part and reduce its emissions. So we've got, the obvious one is in the power sector, which needs to basically transition away from coal, natural gas, towards renewables. But also the vehicles are going to have to move away from petrol cars to electric vehicles, and kind of we've got domestic heating, that kind of thing. That's going to have to move away from largely gas-fired boilers to heat pumps. Each of these things are going to play a key part, and I think over time, there are going to be different drivers of any reduction in emissions. In the near term, it may be emissions from the power sector fall furthest fastest. That's because it's technically easier to replace natural gas-fired power with wind and solar. It takes a lot longer to kind of get the infrastructure in to switch everyone over to electric vehicles. So as emissions reductions from the power sector fall off, that downward drive will start to be taken over by domestic heating, industry, electric vehicles, that kind of thing. But that sets up its own kind of problem here. If we're switching, if we're turning off natural gas, if we're switching all the petrol cars to electric vehicles, if we're phasing out natural gas in favor of heat pumps, then we need a lot more electricity. And if all that electricity is coming from renewable power, that means a huge jump. Renewable power is going to have to at least double, possibly triple over the next kind of few years. That is going to need a huge amount of investment, but it also means that firms, businesses need to start acting now, more or less.
That's interesting, though, Tom, isn't it?
Because so this is where we.
So sorry, Tom. That's interesting because there's an energy demand, there's potential energy crisis in terms of sources of energy. I could imagine business leaders listening in saying, right, okay, I get that. We want to switch. We're looking at getting our energy from renewable sources, but there's a limit on that. The infrastructure isn't there at the moment, and I'm not seeing from COP26 anything that suggests that the money will be there from a UK infrastructure perspective to fulfil that demand let's say by 2030.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. This is going to need a huge amount of investment, a lot more than has been, allocated either by the government or businesses yet. But the trend is going the right way. These things are happening, and there are lots of kind of other things that businesses can do, not just kind of using renewable energy. On this chart, for example, the most common action that businesses have taken is switching to LED light bulbs. That's super easy, but actually quite dramatically reduces the amount of energy used for lighting.
This statistic was taken by the ONS, and I think it was across all businesses in the UK. But that's skewed to the size of business. The smaller businesses tend to be doing some of the changing the LED light bulbs is kind of an easy step. And what we've heard from our panelists in terms of large corporates, global businesses, in terms of what they're doing, that this is completely different. It's interesting because our recent RSM survey on the climate, we asked a very similar question in terms of what actions are UK middle market businesses taking. And 42% of them were saying, right, we're looking at changing our equipment to more energy efficient equipment and moving our IT onto the cloud as a deemed way of reducing our immediate carbon footprint. Okay, the problem's gone somewhere else, arguably, but they were the two largest single things that respondents to our survey had said they were doing, as well as probably changing light bulbs.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think the other thing that strikes me on this chart is that the second most common action that businesses said they're taking is no action at all. And this slide kind of brings out some of the possible reasons for why they're not taking action. It may be too expensive. They are not sure kind of what actions to take. These kind of examples.
Yeah.
And then, if we drill down kind of a little bit further, we see that by far the majority of businesses haven't even started to do a risk assessment or to think about what ways climate change may kind of impact their business.
What was the period, Tom? What was the period of assessment? Can you recall? Was this 2019-20 that these statistics were?
So this is actually much more recent. This
Right.
is October. This is the first 2 weeks in October. So this should be, as up to date as economic data gets, really.
Wow. Okay.
So now, if we really come on to the meat of it, or what I think is the exciting bit, and we get back to that question that you first posed, Simon, about the kind of trade-off between economic growth and carbon emissions. And on this chart, I think that it blows it completely out of the water. Since 1965, UK carbon emissions have halved, while the economy has grown threefold. There's obviously not a trade-off between increases in economic growth, increases in living standards, and reducing your reliance reducing your carbon emissions. I think there's probably two more points worth mentioning here as well. The first is kind of going back to the first session that you and Joe had, which was that if you phrase this as an either or problem, if you say to people, you either have to reduce your emissions, or you have to increase your living standards. If you can't do them both at the same time, a lot of people are going to choose to carry on increasing their living standards, especially in the developing world, and that's going to do more harm than good. The second point, and I think we touched on this in the second panel, is that there's going to be a huge amount of investment needed to fund to fund this transition, and that investment is only going to come from strong economies and strong economic growth. If you start sacrificing economic growth, you're going to do more harm than good over the long term.
Tom, are you going to see a situation, so you've got it on this slide here, where an expectation from governments is going to be on organisations to actually do more in terms of that investment for the transition? And I guess this is what this slide will be explaining.
I think it's going to come down to, it's going to come down to everyone. It's going to be governments, it's going to be businesses, and it's going to be households. The government is going to have to put the frameworks in place and may have to, do some initial investment in order to build infrastructure or jumpstart things. Think about electric vehicles is a great example here. People don't want to buy electric vehicles because there's not enough charging stations. People don't want to build charging stations because there's not enough electric vehicles. The government can step in and provide, some of that initial infrastructure to really get the ball going. But it's also going to be reliant on households to better insulate houses. In the UK, we have a notoriously kind of drafty, leaky old houses that need insulation. It's going to be on households to switch to electric vehicles. And it's going to be on businesses to kind of take whatever action they can to reduce their own carbon emissions. So I think in this chart, the CCC estimate that the UK needs about £50 billion a year of investment across the economy in order to fund that transition to net zero by 2050. Now, that sounds like a colossal amount of money, but in context, UK governments and businesses invest about £400 billion a year. So we're talking about a little over a 10% increase in investment over the next 30 years. A big ask, but certainly not completely unachievable. And I think the thing that a lot of people forget or goes unnoticed when we talk about this is that this is not just kind of throwing money away. These investments have payoffs. As Joe said in the first session, if you switch to renewable energy, eventually your energy bills go down because you're not paying for gas, coal, it's just wind power. If you're insulating your home, your heating bills goes down. So all of these investments have a payoff, that reduces your outgoings. Now, there is a delay with this, so you don't see this benefit immediately. The cost is an upfront cost, and the payoffs are gradual, which is where I think some of the cognitive dissonance comes in a little bit. But eventually the cost savings will offset a large proportion of these investments. And if we just take it either another step back, all this flurry of investment in whatever it is, renewable power or electric vehicles, this is going to be good for the economy. These create high productivity jobs. This is more spending. If we're importing less fossil fuels, natural gas from Russia, for example, that gives us more money to spend in the domestic economy, boosting kind of domestic firms, goods and services. The economy could be 2% greater than it would otherwise be by 2040. Employment could be 1% higher. So rather than the transition to net zero being a large drain on the economy, if anything, it could be a boost. I think that's a really important point that does not get mentioned enough in the media and around this narrative. And then I think the second point to talk about is that you and Joe covered in the last bit of your panel session is GDP even really the right thing to be thinking about? GDP essentially measures what can be measured, and as you gave the example of a tree's not worth anything till it's cut down is a great one. But there are possibly other things that we want to think about as well. Happiness, lifestyles, life expectancy, all of these kind of things, which we quite often use kind of GDP and GDP per capita as a proxy for. And as Joe was saying, with kind of new data sources, we can start to incorporate some of these and get measures that are much more holistic about how society as a whole is doing, not just kind of the financial parts of the economy.
Tom, let's,
so here I've just...
Can you go back to that slide, that Venn diagram, Tom? Let's see. I'd like to see what Joe, what do you think of this happiness index? It makes me smile because I'm thinking, actually, Tom, you're absolutely right. GDP by proxy kind of measures some of these things that are on this chart. Do you think at some point in the 21st century, we're going to be measuring output in a different way on the lines that are covered here? So we're gone beyond GDP on that inner ring, but we're looking at well-being and then lifestyle indicators leading eventually to that happiness index.
Well, I think that it's natural that our measurement of GDP is going to evolve and change, and that policy judgments are informed by a wide range of data, not just growth data. And I want to make sure that we put that forward today, that as we learn more, we have more data, we have better data, and we now have the tools to utilize that data. It's only natural that our policy judgment is going to be better informed, and we'll evolve along with it. So yeah, I think that this is great. In the field of economics, happiness has been a long and very profitable, no pun intended, path of research. And I think that it makes sense as younger people take power and they reshape our institutions. It makes sense that alternative measures of well-being are integrated and incorporated into informed policy judgments, and that's going to change things. And that's, from my point of view, that's constructive.
Yeah, Tom, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm quite fond of telling people that economics is fundamentally about happiness. It's about trying to fulfill unlimited wants with limited resources, and how you maximize your utility, which is fundamentally your happiness. So I think it's very natural that kind of economics progresses this way. One example is this happiness index, Happy Planet Index. Sorry, it takes things like life expectancy, a measure of environmental impact, a measure of economics, and some surveys around well-being, kind of merges them all into one and says how is the economy, how is society doing. Now there are loads of different kind of these measures. None of them have kind of really taken off yet. But this is just one example of the kind of thing that we may be looking at a lot more kind of in the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's going to be fascinating, isn't it? Just take the point that there's as more of the boomer generation retires, as more of the Generation X group retires, we're going to get to a position where actually people are going to look at things in a completely different way going forward. So, okay, Tom, based on what you've heard today, any additional observations that has occurred to you? I mean, I think the one thing you've said to me before, and actually you've said it this afternoon, which I think was a massive surprise, is actually that point that actually investing in, operationally a business investing in green technology does not necessarily negatively affect their output and their efficiency. There might be a lag, and that chart was great in showing that, but over time, it's going to pay dividends.
Yeah, I really think that's the key point that, if anybody takes anything away from this session, I think that would be it, that, economic growth, productivity, profitability, and reducing your impact on the environment are not mutually exclusive things. If anything, they very much go together. I think, that's the key message.
Thanks, Tom. Joe, any final words before we draw this session to a close?
Sure. As the structure of our economies changed, as we move towards a more digital world, remember that the discussion we're having today is profoundly organized around the economy of scarcity. Tom's spot on when he identifies the current state of the economy. But as we move towards a more digital future, we'll be talking about the economy of abundance, where when something's digitized, the cost of reproduction, distribution, and access tends to fall to zero. And that, my friends, is the path towards a more sustainable, cleaner, and greener future. And I think that it's good to close on a note of optimism, that the innovations inside the UK economy, inside the American economy, inside the European economy are driving us towards that future. And it's good that we continue to remind ourselves that, there are going to be challenges. We might not get all the way to our goals in the time frame that we want, but things are going to get better. And I would expect you'll see that sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Joe, for ending on a positive journey to the sunny uplands of the mid-21st century. I think we'll all look forward to getting there. But seriously, thank you for your insight, Tom. Thank you, Joe, as ever, for joining us from the US. I hope you out there have taken some good points away from this session. Apologies for some of the technical glitches that we've had during the afternoon, but hey, that's doing stuff live, and that's the way we roll in a post-pandemic environment. But there's a lot of material that's available on our website, rsmuk.com. Go to the Real Economy section and you'll find a lot of great material, particularly around ESG, infrastructure, and Tom's comments on the UK economy and links to Joe talking about the US and the global economy. So please go and visit that.